Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine being handed a one-way ticket to the capital city of your nation's absolute worst enemy.
Right, that's terrifying, just as a concept.
Oh, completely. And, we are not talking about a standard political rival here. We are talking about a superpower known for literally skinning its captives alive.
Yeah, and leaving their skulls in, like piles outside the conquered gates. Just brutal.
Exactly. And you were told to walk alone into the center of this hostile metropolis and basically announce to hundreds of thousands of violent warriors that their world is ending.
Which sounds like a suicide mission.
Right. But that is the actual premise of the story we are exploring today.
Yeah.
Most of us mistakenly think of it as this sanitized children's picture book tale about a guy getting swallowed by a whale.
Yeah, the classic Sunday school flannel board story.
Yeah. Yes. But strip away that Sunday school veneer, and we are left with the Book of Jonah. It's this profoundly mature, psychologically complex ancient document. Our mission in this deep dive is to act as your guides, extracting practical wisdom, moral insight, and real-life application from a narrative that is, frankly, shockingly relevant to the 21st century.
It really is a masterpiece of ancient literature. I mean, when you approach the text with fresh eyes and just set aside those childhood preconceptions, you uncover a narrative that deals heavily with prejudice.
And duty, right, or the evasion of it.
Exactly. Evasion of duty, the limits of human compassion, and, well, the boundless and often incredibly uncomfortable nature of divine grace.
Uncomfortable is definitely the word. Okay, let's unpack this because the subversion of expectations here is brilliant.
Oh, that starts immediately.
Right out of the gate. We are looking at a story where the foundations of a traditional hero's journey are completely inverted. The supposed hero, the prophet who should be the paragon of virtue, is actually the villain of his own success.
He does literally everything in his power to sabotage the mission.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the supposed pagans, the foreign sailors, the enemy king, they end up acting far more righteous and morally grounded than the man representing God.
It's the author telegraphing to the reader that all your assumptions about who the good guys and bad guys are, they just need to be thrown out the window.
Which is such a modern literary technique, really.
It is, and the text actually establishes that subversion from the very first syllable in the original Hebrew.
Wait, really? The first syllable?
Yeah. The book starts with the word now, or if you translate it more literally, the conjunction and. It reads, "And the word of the Lord came to Jonah."
Huh. Starting a book with "and" feels like walking into the middle of a movie.
That's exactly the point. In ancient Hebrew texts, beginning a book with "and" is this very specific structural bridge. It connects the events of this book directly to the broader ongoing history of humanity.
So it's telling the original reader that this isn't some isolated mythological fable happening in a vacuum.
Right. It's a direct continuation of a much larger historical sequence.
So it's picking up right where the previous historical records left off. What was happening right before this moment that makes the word "and" so significant?
Well, prior to this narrative, the historical records show that the kings and people of Israel had been stubbornly ignoring their own prophets.
Right. Figures like Elijah and Elisha.
Exactly. God had sent them, complete with profound warnings, but the nation persevered in its unrepentance. They were just completely closed off.
So by starting with "and," it's communicating a shift.
Yes. Implicitly, it's saying because the insiders have hardened their necks and refused to listen, and therefore the call goes out to the outsiders.
Wow, that is an ominous transition for the original audience.
It really is. The grace and the prophetic warnings are spilling over the borders. It signals that if the people who are supposed to listen won't pay attention, the message will be taken directly to their worst enemies.
And not just any enemy. I mean, the instruction is incredibly specific. Arise, go to Nineveh. We really need to unpack what Nineveh represented to a person living in the ancient Near East, because this wasn't just some neighboring village.
No, this was the crown jewel of the Assyrian Empire. The scale and the reputation of Nineveh are crucial for understanding the psychological weight of this entire narrative.
How big was it, actually?
Well, the text refers to it as that great city, which translates more literally as a city great to God. That implies a magnitude that defies normal human scales.
Right.
We are talking about a metropolis that was roughly 60 miles in circumference.
60 miles?
Yeah, with sprawling administrative districts, massive defensive walls, surrounding suburbs. It took a 3 days journey just to traverse its territories.
So the size alone is intimidating.
Absolutely. But size was only a fraction of its terror. Nineveh was the center of the Assyrian war machine.
Right, and their military strategy, from what I understand, wasn't just about conquering territory. It was heavily reliant on psychological terror.
Yes, they wanted nations to surrender before the battle even started, purely out of fear.
Because they engineered an entire culture around severe violence.
They really did. The historical records, like their own reliefs and stone monuments, they boast about their brutality. They would flay enemy kings alive and
then nail their skins to city walls.
Exactly. They would blind prisoners, cut off appendages, deport entire populations just to break their national identity.
It's just horrific.
Ancient historians liken Nineveh to a den of lions, a place where the lion tore enough meat for his whelps.
So when the text says that their wickedness had come up before God, it wasn't talking about, general immorality or bad manner.
No. It was referring to a highly organized, systemic, brutal oppression of human life.
Okay, so let's look at the mandate God gives Jonah. Walk into the capital city of this ancient terror state, a place heavily guarded by seasoned, violent warriors, and tell them that judgment is imminent.
Yeah. What?
Frankly, having a panic attack seems like the only rational human response here.
It really does.
But Jonah's reaction is what makes the psychology of this story so fascinating. The text says, "But Jonah rose up to flee from the presence of the Lord."
And he doesn't just, drag his feet or hide in his basement?
No, he goes the absolute opposite way. Nineveh is to the northeast, across the desert. Jonah heads straight west. He goes to the Mediterranean port of Joppa, buys a ticket on a cargo ship, and sets sail for a place called Tarshish.
Tarshish represents the absolute furthest known edge of the ancient map.
Where was it exactly?
Well, historians debate its exact location, but the consensus strongly points to a wealthy merchant city on the coast of Spain, past the Pillars of Hercules, what we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar.
So literally the edge of the world for them.
Exactly. In the ancient mind, sailing to Tarshish was equivalent to flying to the edge of the solar system. These journeys required massive Phoenician cargo ships.
Like the ancient equivalent of deep-sea oil tankers.
Perfect analogy. And it took years to complete a round trip. Jonah is attempting to put as much physical distance and as much ocean as humanly possible between himself and his calling.
He is trying to run beyond the borders of his known universe, which raises an immediate logical problem.
Right.
Jonah is a prophet.
Yeah.
He explicitly states later that he believes God made the sea and the dry land. He understands theology.
He knows his stuff, yeah.
Right. He knows intellectually that you cannot outrun an omnipresent creator. So why does he try? What is the actual mechanism of his flight?
Well, he isn't fleeing God's literal omnipresence. He is attempting to flee God's jurisdiction.
Oh, that's interesting.
He is renouncing his office by removing himself from the geography where he believes that office operates. It's an attempt to force a resignation.
If I'm not in the office, I don't have to do the job.
Precisely. And if you look closely at the language used in this sequence, the author weaves in a profound motif of dissent to illustrate the reality of this evasion. Notice the verbs.
Okay.
Jonah goes down to Joppa. Then he goes down into the ship.
Oh, wow.
And later, as the storm hits, he goes down into the innermost parts of the hold. It is a literal, physical manifestation of a psychological and spiritual reality.
Which is what?
That stepping away from your moral obligation, running from your true calling, always takes you down.
The geography of disobedience is a downward spiral. That is such a visceral image, and I want to translate this for you, the listener, right now.
Let's bring it into the present.
Because none of us are ancient prophets being told to preach to the Assyrian Empire.
Yeah.
But the psychological reaction Jonah has is universally human.
Absolutely.
When we are faced with a massive, terrifying responsibility, we look for an exit. I mean, think about a time when you knew you needed to have a brutal, truth-telling conversation with a family member.
Or when you realized you had to dismantle a toxic situation at work.
Yes. Or when your conscience was screaming at you to make a major life change. What did you do?
We engage in avoidance behavior. When a duty is deeply uncomfortable, or when doing the right thing violently conflicts with our personal prejudices, our safety, or just our desire for comfort, we immediately try to book a ticket to our own personal Tarshish.
Yes, and we see this all the time. You know you need to end that relationship, but instead of doing it, you suddenly take on 3 new projects at work.
Right. Burying yourself in endless busy work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you numb the anxiety by doom scrolling for hours, binge watching television, or even just literally sleeping all day to quiet your own mind. We manufacture distance.
We create noise to drown out the internal voice that is telling us exactly what we need to do.
So a practical reflection for you right now. What is your Tarshish? When you are actively avoiding your own Nineveh, that difficult but necessary calling, where do you escape to? What is the mechanism you use to silence your conscience?
That's the question, isn't it? Furthermore, the text includes this tiny but devastating detail about that escape. It notes that Jonah paid the fare thereof.
Oh, wow.
Avoidance is never free. We pay a steep price to run from our obligations. We purchase our own peril.
That's powerful.
We spend our emotional energy, our financial resources, our time, and our peace of mind to secure a passage away from the very things that, if confronted, would actually bring us growth and resolution.
We finance our own downward spiral.
We finance our own downward spiral.
But, as Jonah discovers, you can pay the fare, you can board the ship, and you can watch the shore disappear. But reality is eventually going to crash into your vessel.
It always does.
The text says that the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, a mighty tempest, so violent that the ship was literally threatening to break apart.
The phrasing in Hebrew implies that the ship itself almost had a conscious sense of its own doom.
Like it knew it was going to die.
Yeah, groaning and heaving under the localized, targeted weight of this storm. And this introduces the sharp contrast between Jonah and the pagan mariners.
Right, these aren't just amateur boaters.
No, these sailors are not novices. They are seasoned Phoenician tradesmen who have navigated the Mediterranean for years. They know how to ride out bad weather.
But this storm is different.
It is entirely anomalous. It is so sudden, so unnaturally violent that these veterans are utterly terrified.
They start throwing things overboard.
Desperately hurling their precious cargo into the sea to lighten the vessel. They're sacrificing their livelihoods just to buy a few more minutes of buoyancy.
And in the midst of this chaos, they are crying out, "Every man to his own God."
Meanwhile, where is our runaway prophet?
Down in the innermost parts of the ship, fast asleep. The sheer irony is staggering.
It really is.
Up on the deck, the pagan sailors are engaging in a desperate theology of survival, praying to any deity that might exist. Down in the dark, the one man on board who actually has a relationship with the creator of the ocean, the one man whose actions summoned the hurricane, is snoring.
Yeah.
How is it physiologically possible to sleep while a massive wooden ship is being torn apart by waves?
Well, psychologically and neurologically, this makes perfect sense. This is not the sleep of a peaceful mind.
No.
It is the heavy, stupefying sleep of severe avoidance and depression. When the human brain is overwhelmed by massive cognitive dissonance, the agonizing gap between what you know you should do and what you're actually doing, it expends tremendous amounts of energy.
So he's just tapped out.
Jonah is exhausted. He has been running from his own conscience. Sin, rebellion, and profound avoidance have this intoxicating, numbing effect. His nervous system is essentially shutting down to protect him from the sheer terror of his reality.
It is the ultimate form of escapism, falling unconscious to avoid the storm you created.
But the world won't let him stay unconscious. The shipmaster finds him in the hold, shakes him awake, and screams at him.
"What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will give a thought to us that we may not perish."
It's incredible. The universe is using a pagan sea captain to deliver a moral rebuke to a sleeping prophet.
But Jonah's prayers aren't going to stop the wind. The sailors realize this isn't a normal weather event. They know it has a supernatural origin.
Right.
So they decide to cast lots to figure out whose fault this is. How exactly did casting lots work in this ancient context?
What's fascinating here is that casting lots, or kleromancy, was an ancient form of divination used across many cultures. It usually involved throwing marked stones, sticks, or dice to determine the will of the gods or to uncover hidden information.
But wasn't that forbidden for the Hebrews?
Exactly. From a strict theological standpoint, in the ancient Hebrew context, using divination to seek hidden knowledge was largely forbidden, as it crossed into superstition.
So why does it work here?
Because what occurs here is a fascinating intersection.
Yeah.
God overrules their human superstition. He hijacks their cultural practice.
Oh, wow.
He uses the flawed, panicked methods of these terrified sailors to accomplish his exact will, manipulating the outcome of the lots to point the finger directly at his runaway prophet.
And the lot falls on Jonah. Now, I have to pause and push back on the narrative here because there's something deeply unsettling about this scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we view this objectively, isn't it profoundly unfair?
Unfair to who?
To the sailors. You have a crew of innocent sailors who are just trying to do their jobs, haul their cargo, feed their families, and now they are about to drown in the middle of the sea, losing their wares and their lives entirely because of Jonah's private, personal rebellion. Why should they be caught in the crossfire of his spiritual crisis?
That is a critical observation, and it dismantles a very modern, hyper-individualized myth that we cling to.
Which is?
We love to believe that our choices occur in a vacuum. We tell ourselves that our private toxic habits, our hidden resentments, or our evasion of responsibility only affect us.
Like it's my life, I'm only hurting myself.
Precisely, I'm only hurting myself. But the reality of human existence is that we are deeply interconnected. The storms we manufacture in our private lives almost always threaten to sink the people who are sailing with us.
Wow. That is a terrifying thought. Our private storms create public casualties.
Yes. When an individual refuses to deal with their own trauma, when a leader evades their moral responsibility, or when a person harbors deep bitterness, the collateral damage inevitably radiates outward.
It affects their families, their coworkers, their friends.
And often entirely innocent bystanders like these sailors. Jonah's attempt to be a private runaway instantly transformed him into a public hazard. You cannot rebel in a vacuum.
So the people sailing with us bear the brunt of our hidden chaos. And now the sailors have Jonah cornered. They hold this makeshift tribunal right there on the heaving, slippery deck of the ship.
A trial in a hurricane.
Literally, they interrogate him. Tell us, on whose account has this evil come upon us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are?
And Jonah is forced to drop the disguise.
He steps up and confesses, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land.
Now, pay close attention to the psychological shift in the sailors when he says that. The text says that the men were exceedingly afraid.
Because they realize who they're dealing with.
Right. A moment ago, they were terrified of the weather. Now they are terrified of the divine. They hear Jonah say he is actively fleeing from the very architect of the ocean that is currently trying to crush them.
That's a whole new level of fear.
They recognize the awesome, inescapable reality of a creator who can command the natural elements to hunt down a single fugitive. So they look at Jonah and ask the ultimate pragmatic question. What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?
And Jonah's answer is staggering. He says, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you.
He accepts the blame.
He pronounces his own death sentence. But what happens next is arguably the most profound moral moment in the first half of the book.
The sailor's reaction.
Yes, the sailors refuse to do it.
It is a stunning display of human morality that sharply contrasts with Jonah's earlier disposition. These untaught pagan mariners show an immense respect for human life, a respect that the prophet of God currently lacks.
Because Jonah was perfectly willing to let hundreds of thousands of people in Nineveh burn because they were his enemies.
Exactly. But these sailors, they refused to execute one clearly guilty man to save their own skins. Instead, the text says they dug in.
They rowed harder.
They took their oars and rowed with everything they had, striving with all their physical might against the supernatural wrath of God, desperately trying to bring the ship back to dry land to spare Jonah's life.
It's an incredible scene. They are holding court in the middle of a hurricane, weighing the evidence, and they choose mercy over self-preservation.
They even pause to pray to Jonah's God, pleading, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood."
But the sea just grows more and more tempestuous. The resistance is futile. Finally, recognizing they have absolutely no other choice, they pick Jonah up and cast him into the raging sea.
And the response of the ocean is instantaneous. The text says the sea ceased from its raging. It stood still.
Just like that.
It is depicted almost as a loyal servant that was sent on a violent errand, and the moment it accomplishes its task of securing the fugitive, it immediately returns to rest.
Which entirely validates Jonah's confession to the sailors.
Right. The sailors are so overwhelmed by this display of sovereign power that they offer sacrifices and make vows to the God of Israel. In a twist of deep irony, God uses Jonah's rebellion and failure to bring these foreign sailors to a profound reverence for the truth.
Wow.
But for Jonah, the descent is far from over. He is sinking into the black, freezing depths of the Mediterranean, facing the ultimate fatal consequence of his flight.
Which brings us to one of the most famous and most misunderstood elements of this entire narrative. Here's where it gets really interesting. Just as Jonah is drowning, just as he is losing consciousness and the seaweed is wrapping around his head, God intervenes in a truly bizarre way. The text says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah." Now, for centuries, pop culture has portrayed the fish as the ultimate punishment, the monster sent to eat the bad guy.
Right, Pinocchio style.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you look at the mechanics of the story, the fish isn't the punishment at all. It is a rescue vehicle.
That is a vital distinction. The ocean was the punishment. The fish was the salvation.
I mean, God could have kept Jonah miraculously breathing water, or he could have sent a piece of driftwood.
But instead, he appointed this vast marine creature. It becomes a living grave, a place of total sensory-deprived confinement. Jonah is completely cut off from the sun, from humanity, from any illusion of control.
Yeah.
And it is in this dark, fetid, impossible prison in the literal belly of the beast that Jonah finally does what he should have done the moment God called him in chapter 1.
He prays. He prays.
Yeah.
The entirety of chapter 2 is dedicated to this prayer. And the structure of this forced pause is deeply revealing. Jonah doesn't pray while he's packing his bags for Tarshish. He doesn't pray on the ship. He waits until he hits absolute catastrophic rock bottom. He describes his location poetically as going down to the roots of the mountains, into the very foundation of the earth, with the bars of the earth closing over him forever.
And the theology embedded in his prayer is remarkable. He is praying from inside the digestive tract of a sea monster, entirely trapped, with zero human probability of survival. Yet, look at the grammar he uses.
What do you mean?
He speaks almost entirely in the past tense. He says, "I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me." He doesn't say, "I am calling, please answer." He says, "You brought up my life from the pit."
So he's speaking like it's a done deal.
His faith in this moment is so robust that the mere fact he is still conscious, still drawing breath in this dark void, is absolute proof to him that the rescue has already occurred. The deliverance is an accomplished fact in his mind, even though he hasn't been returned to dry land yet.
That takes a breathtaking level of faith. To be sitting in the absolute dark, smelling the gastric juices of a sea creature, completely isolated, and to say, "Thank you, God, for saving me." Let's translate this to our 21st century reality, because the psychological parallels here are stunning. Sometimes we run from our responsibilities. We make terrible choices. We finance our own destructive paths, and we sink our own ships.
And then we are swallowed by a massive crisis.
Right. It might be a sudden severe health diagnosis. It might be a public failure, a devastating bankruptcy, or an unexpected job loss that leaves us completely isolated and stripped of our identity.
And in those moments of crisis, our immediate human reaction is to view the confinement as a punishment. We feel buried alive by our circumstances. The walls close in and we assume we are being destroyed.
Exactly. But what if that crisis is the fish? What if that dark, uncomfortable, forced isolation is actually the only vehicle capable of saving you from drowning in the stormy sea of your own bad choices?
Well, that's a profound way to look at it.
It abruptly stops your downward descent. It forces you into a timeout where you can no longer run, no longer distract yourself with busy work, and no longer sleep your way through the dissonance. You are forced to sit in the dark and finally look at your life.
Which is exactly what Jonah does.
So the practical question for you, the listener, is this. Have you ever been swallowed by a crisis? Have you ever been forced into a corner by life? When you find yourself in that dark, confined space, how can you use it as a sanctuary for reflection and realignment rather than just treating it as a prison of despair?
That perfectly captures the core wisdom of the forced pause. Jonah utilizes the confinement to reorient his soul. He says, "When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord."
He wakes up.
He recognizes the sheer futility of his previous avoidance. He makes this profound statement. "Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love." By running from his calling to protect his own comfort and his nationalistic pride, which were his idols, he had walked away from the very source of mercy.
Wow.
Having realized this, he offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving from inside the fish. He acknowledges that salvation belongs entirely to God, not to his own maneuvering.
And God responds to that realignment. After 3 days and 3 nights in this living submarine, the Lord speaks to the fish, and it vomits Jonah out onto dry land.
Not the most glamorous exit.
No. He is back in the sunlight, probably covered in seaweed, bleached by stomach acids, and utterly humiliated. But he is alive, and more importantly, he is finally stripped of his illusions and ready to go to work.
This transition brings us to the power of the second chance. The narrative pivots sharply with the opening of chapter 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time.
The second time.
It is a profound testament to the relentless, restorative nature of this calling. God does not find a backup prophet. He doesn't say, "You failed, I'm moving on to someone else." The instructions remain identical. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you.
He doesn't soften the message to make it easier for Jonah.
Not at all. He demands exact obedience, and this time Jonah does not hesitate. The text simply says, "So Jonah rose and went."
He finally makes the trek across the desert and walks into this massive, intimidating capital of the Assyrian war machine. Remember the sheer scale of Nineveh, a 3-day journey just to walk through its metropolitan area?
Right.
Jonah enters the city, walks for a full day into its bustling, violent center, and he delivers what has to be the shortest, bluntest, most unpolished sermon in recorded history.
It's very brief.
In the original Hebrew, it is precisely 5 words. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That is the entire message. There is no eloquent introduction. There is no list of their specific crimes to justify the judgment. There is no altar call or explicit offer of salvation, just a terrifying absolute deadline.
And here we encounter a significant philosophical and theological hurdle that modern readers often stumble over. It requires careful discernment.
Okay, what is it?
Well, the obvious question arises. If God is omniscient, and if he knew from before the foundation of the world that he was going to spare the Ninevites when they repented, why send a prophet to threaten them with absolute destruction in exactly 40 days?
Is God just lying to them?
Exactly. Is the threat a manipulative bait and switch?
Right. It feels like a parent screaming, "I'm going to turn this car around right now,"
Right.
when they have absolutely no intention of canceling the vacation. It feels like an empty threat used purely for behavioral control.
Thomas Aquinas actually solved this philosophical puzzle centuries ago by deeply analyzing the nature of divine warnings.
Oh, really? What did Aquinas say?
Aquinas pointed out that prophecy often reveals the disposition of intermediate causes, rather than a fixed, unalterable fate.
Okay, translate that for us.
Meaning, if you look at the current trajectory of Nineveh, their systemic violence, their brutal economic engine, their total disregard for human life, the natural, inevitable effect of that trajectory intersecting with divine justice is absolute destruction in 40 days.
Okay, I see.
The threat is an honest warning of what will happen if the current path remains unchanged. It is the diagnosis of a terminal illness.
So the word yet is the crucial hinge. Yet 40 days.
Precisely. If God were a true fatalist, if he had unconditionally decreed their doom without any hope of change, he wouldn't bother warning the city at all. He would just send the fire.
That makes a lot of sense.
The very existence of the 40-day window implies a space for grace. It is an invitation to alter the trajectory. As John Chrysostom famously noted regarding this passage, God threatens hell so that he may not have to bring anyone to hell.
Oh, I love that.
He terrifies with words so that he does not have to strike with deeds. The warning is the mercy.
That entirely reframes the concept of a warning. It is not a prediction of an unchangeable fate. It is an intervention. It is God crashing the system before the system destroys itself.
Exactly.
And the reaction of Nineveh to this 5-word intervention is nothing short of radical. The text says, "And the people of Nineveh believed God." It isn't a slow, gradual awakening. It is an immediate grassroots panic that surges upward all the way to the highest halls of power.
It reaches the king.
The news reaches the absolute monarch of the Assyrian Empire. This king, the most feared man on the planet, steps off his throne. He takes off his royal purple robes, covers himself with harsh, irritating sackcloth, and sits in the ashes.
It is a total societal inversion of power and pride. The king issues a massive decree. He states, "Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands."
Okay, we have to address a detail here that sounds almost comical to a modern ear. The animals in sackcloth.
Yeah, the cows in mourning.
We are picturing herds of cows and flocks of sheep draped in black mourning clothes, moaning in the streets of Nineveh because they haven't been fed. It sounds bizarre.
It is a striking, almost surreal image, and we must apply historical discernment to understand it. In the ancient Near East, animals were deeply integrated into the emotional and social fabric of the community.
Like how we view pets.
Partially, but also symbolically. Just as a modern state funeral might feature a riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups to symbolize the magnitude of loss, The Ninevites incorporated their livestock into their mourning rituals to reflect the absolute severity of the crisis.
But there is a much deeper economic reality beneath the symbolism, isn't there? By forcing the animals to fast, they aren't just putting on a play.
Absolutely. Think about the mechanics of an ancient city. If the herds and flocks are fasting and mourning, they are not plowing the fields, they are not pulling the carts, they are not producing milk or wool.
Everything stops.
The king was essentially ordering a complete shutdown of the city's agricultural and economic engine. He was crashing the economic mainframe. This wasn't just a few individuals feeling privately guilty in their homes.
You're systemic.
The entire society, down to its foundational infrastructure, halted production to sit in absolute humility and terror before God. It is a collective, systemic hard reset.
I want to frame that for our modern context. Think about what a systemic hard reset looks like today. Imagine a highly toxic corporate culture or a deeply polarized society suddenly being confronted with the reality of its own impending ruin.
Right.
Imagine the leadership actually looking in the mirror, halting everything and saying, stop the assembly lines, log off the servers, freeze all the accounts. We have been fundamentally, systematically wrong, and we have to change our entire operational model today.
And notice the specific demand the king makes. He doesn't just ask them to cry and feel bad. He commands them to turn from the violence that is in their hands.
That phrase is so specific.
That phrase is the defining metric of true repentance. In Hebrew, the idiom "in their hands" literally refers to the hollow of the palms, the instruments used to grasp gains, to exploit others, and to commit violence.
Wow.
The king recognizes that emotional mourning is useless without behavioral restitution. They could not continue to hold on to the profits of their brutality and simultaneously ask God for forgiveness. The behavior had to stop. The supply chain of violence had to be severed.
You cannot keep the winning and keep the sinning. It doesn't work. So for you listening right now, here is the practical takeaway from Nineveh's response. If you want to change your life, if you want to avoid the impending ruin of a toxic habit or a fractured relationship, don't just put on emotional sackcloth.
Feeling sorry is not the same as changing.
Exactly. Identify the specific violence in your hands. What is the destructive habit? What is the toxic gossip you actively participate in? What is the selfish behavior that benefits you at the expense of someone else? Identify it and actively drop it. Open your hands and let it go.
And because the people of Nineveh actually did that, the narrative reaches an incredible climax. The text states, when God saw what they did, or they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it.
He spared them.
He observed that their repentance was genuine, backed by systemic action, and in accordance with his merciful nature, he spared the city.
Which, in any normal, conventional story, would be the triumphant, swelling music happy ending.
Cue the credits.
Right. The terrible enemy repents, a city of over 100,000 people is saved from incineration, and the prophet is hailed as the most wildly successful messenger in history. But this is where the story pivots from a study of human repentance into a dark, psychological study of human resentment.
Yeah, the twist.
For Jonah, this happy ending is his absolute worst nightmare. We enter the final chapter, and the text says, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry." The Hebrew root words there indicate a burning, consuming rage.
He is furious. He feels utterly betrayed. And he unleashes a prayer of complaint that is essentially a bitter "I told you so" directed at the Almighty.
Oh, it's so petulant.
He prays, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster."
The audacity of this prayer is astounding. He is taking the most beautiful, comforting, foundational attributes of God, his grace, his endless mercy, his profound patience, and hurling them back in God's face as an accusation.
Yeah, it's wild.
He is essentially saying, I knew you were too soft to pull the trigger on these people.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand this anger, we have to examine the dark roots of in-group and out-group bias.
Okay, unpack that.
Jonah's rage stems from a deeply misplaced patriotism and a fundamentally prejudiced heart. Jonah loved Israel. He knew that the Assyrian Empire was a looming existential threat to his nation's survival. He did not want his enemies to experience a spiritual awakening. He wanted them eradicated.
He wants them wiped off the map.
He is attempting to weaponize his theology for geopolitical gain. In his mind, grace is a zero-sum game. If God is merciful to the enemy, God is betraying his own people.
The blinding hypocrisy here is almost difficult to process. Jonah, the runaway prophet, literally just received a miraculous, entirely unmerited rescue from the digestive tract of a sea monster.
Exactly.
He flagrantly rebelled, and he was saved by the sheer, unearned grace of God. Yet, mere days later, he is incandescent with rage when that exact same grace is applied to someone else.
It is the classic tragic human condition. We desperately demand grace, forgiveness, and understanding for ourselves, but we demand strict, merciless, fire and brimstone justice for our enemies. It is the tragedy of a narrow heart trying to police the boundaries of an infinite compassion. Jonah is operating from a mindset of absolute scarcity.
Right.
He is so consumed by his tribalism and his nationalistic zeal that he has lost all basic human empathy for the hundreds of thousands of individual souls living in Nineveh. He cannot see them as human beings. He only sees them as a threat to be neutralized.
Translating this to our modern world is deeply uncomfortable because it hits so close to home. We live in an era defined by intense vitriolic polarization. Think about how human nature operates today across political lines, social demographics, or ideological divides.
Oh, it's everywhere.
We love the concepts of grace, rehabilitation, and second chances when they apply to our side. When someone in our in-group makes a terrible mistake, we say, well, they're only human. We need to show compassion and look at the context.
We need to understand their trauma.
Exactly. But when someone on the other side makes a mistake, we demand absolute destruction. We want them canceled, ruined, and stripped of everything.
We actively hate it when people we have categorized as monsters actually improve, apologize, or find redemption.
Yes. It enrages us because it challenges our neat, comfortable categories of who the good guys and bad guys are. We want the satisfaction of seeing our enemies destroyed.
That is a profound parallel. And Jonah is so locked into those neat categories, so addicted to his resentment, that he would rather die than see his worldview dismantled by God's mercy.
He literally asks to die.
Right. He literally prays, "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." The sheer petulance of this is staggering. He is standing at the epicenter of the greatest mass repentance in human history, and he wants to die simply because he was denied the satisfaction of watching a fireworks display of divine wrath.
So here's a hard, necessary reflection for now. Who is your Nineveh? Who is the specific individual, the political group, or the demographic that you secretly hope fails, whose public destruction or humiliation would give you a dark sense of satisfaction?
That is a tough question to sit with.
And more importantly, how does your resentment of their potential success or redemption poison your own soul? Because Jonah isn't hurting Nineveh with his anger, he is entirely poisoning himself.
God's response to this suicidal temper tantrum is a masterclass in gentle Socratic intervention. He doesn't strike Jonah with lightning for his insubordination. He simply asks a piercing question. Do you do well to be angry?
Just a simple question.
God then allows Jonah to act out his frustration. Jonah marches out of the city, builds a small booth or shelter on a hill to the east, and sits there in the shade. He is stubbornly, pathetically waiting to see if God might change his mind and nuke the city after all.
He literally sets up a lawn chair to watch an apocalypse that he knows isn't coming. It's absurd, but it perfectly captures the stubbornness of human resentment. And this leads us to the final brilliant act of this narrative.
The plant, the worm, and the wind.
Yes, the object lesson. The text says God appointed a plant. Historians often identify it as a broad-leafed castor oil plant or a gourd, and made it grow up over Jonah in a single night to give him shade and deliver him from his discomfort. And the text notes that Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant.
Notice the severe psychological whiplash here. Jonah's emotional regulation is completely broken. Just moments ago, he was furiously angry and begging to die over the salvation of 120,000 human beings.
Right.
Now he is overjoyed and thrilled because a leafy weed grew over his head to give him a bit of personal comfort. His entire emotional center of gravity is tethered exclusively to his own physical convenience.
But the universe is about to remove that convenience, because at dawn the next day, God appoints a worm. The worm attacked the root of the plant, and it instantly withers and dies.
Which is devastating for him.
And then, as if the loss of his little shade canopy isn't enough, God orchestrates the environment to break Jonah completely. He appoints a scorching east wind. Let's talk about the reality of what that wind was, because it wasn't just a warm summer breeze.
Oh no. The meteorological phenomenon described here is widely known in the Middle East as the sirocco, or the Khamsin wind. This is a violent, oppressive wind blowing straight off the Arabian desert.
It's essentially a blast furnace.
Exactly. It brings a sudden, massive spike in temperature, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It is so dry that it instantly evaporates human perspiration, completely inhibiting the body's ability to cool itself.
That sounds miserable.
It fills the air with fine, suffocating dust, drying up the palate and the respiratory tract. The physiological effects are devastating. It induces severe lethargy, migraines, and heat stroke.
And the sun is beating down directly on Jonah's unprotected head. He is fainting, he's physiologically miserable, and once again his response is a suicidal tantrum. He asks to die, saying, "It is better for me to die than to live."
This is the moment where God delivers the core, devastating wisdom of the entire book. He asks Jonah again, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?"
And what does Jonah say?
Jonah, entirely lacking in self-awareness and consumed by his own misery, snaps back, "Yes, I do well to be angry enough to die."
The audacity.
And then God exposes the profound, tragic absurdity of Jonah's heart, and by extension, the absurdity of human nature itself.
God says to him, "You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?"
It is a masterful argument, contrasting the lesser with the greater. God is holding up a mirror to Jonah's warped, self-centered priorities. God points out that Jonah is weeping in absolute despair over a weed.
Right.
It was a plant he didn't create. It existed for a single day, and its only discernible value to Jonah was that it temporarily made him physically comfortable.
Yet he's furious about the city.
Right. Jonah is incandescent with rage that God, the creator and sustainer of all life, desires to spare a sprawling metropolis filled with 120,000 innocent children, those who literally do not know their right hand from their left, as well as the innocent animals.
Just staggering when you lay it out like that.
Jonah's compassion is entirely selfish, contingent only on what serves his immediate comfort. God's compassion is universal, extending to the intrinsic value of every living thing he has made.
So what does this all mean for us today? This is the ultimate mirror. What are our gourds? Because we all have them. We have our creature comforts, our perfectly curated echo chambers, our status symbols, our petty daily conveniences that shield us from the heat of the day.
Yeah, the things that make our lives easy.
Exactly. And if we are brutally honest with ourselves, we will throw a massive, disproportionate tantrum when our Wi-Fi goes down, when our flight is delayed, when our coffee order is wrong, or when our fragile ego is slightly bruised. We will mourn the loss of our shade.
We really will.
But at the exact same time, we manage to remain utterly apathetic or sometimes actively hostile to the massive systemic suffering of actual human beings around the world, especially if those human beings belong to a group, a nation, or a political party we have labeled as the enemy.
It is a devastating critique of the limits of human empathy. We routinely prioritize our minor, temporary discomforts over the survival and well-being of others. God is challenging Jonah and the reader to align their heart with a divine heart.
To see people the way he sees them.
To recognize that every single person in Nineveh, regardless of their nationality, their past crimes, or their threat level, is a complex soul crafted by God, worthy of pity and capable of redemption.
Think about your emotional reactions this past week. Just take an inventory. What actually made you truly angry or upset? Were you grieving over a withered plant in your life? A minor inconvenience, a lost comfort, a delayed package, while completely ignoring or even secretly cheering for the struggles of the people you dislike?
It's a challenging thought.
Are your emotions entirely tethered to your own comfort? Or do you have a genuine, expansive love for humanity?
And what elevates this book from a simple historical narrative to a timeless literary and theological masterpiece is exactly how it ends, or rather, how it refuses to end.
Right.
The book of Jonah ends on a cliffhanger. We never hear Jonah's response to God's final question. The text just abruptly stops.
Yes. There is no neat little bow tying it all together. There's no epilogue that says, "And then Jonah realized the error of his ways, walked down the hill, and hugged a Ninevite." The question just hangs there in the blistering heat.
It hangs there because the question isn't ultimately for Jonah. By ending the narrative so abruptly, the author turns the camera directly onto the audience. The question pierces through history, bypassing the ancient Assyrians and the Hebrew prophets, and it is aimed directly at the chest of the listener. The ultimate, uncomfortable realization of this deep dive is that you are Jonah. You are the one sitting on the hill, sweating in the heat of your own resentments, desperately clinging to your withered gourds, furious that the universe isn't punishing the people you dislike.
And God is waiting for your answer.
Exactly. The story stops precisely so that your life, your decisions, and your empathy can provide the ending. Will you choose to remain in the prison of your own comfort and your bitter prejudices, or will you allow your heart to be broken open and expanded to align with a divine compassion that includes even your absolute worst enemies?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.